The crash wasn't thunder. It was the scream of steel as a brand new BMW M5 split beneath the weight of a tree no one thought would fall. Karen's arm shot out like a weapon, finger locked on her neighbor, her voice breaking with fury and humiliation as police turned to listen. But the secret wasn't the car. It was what had been hidden hours before, and the truth would unravel faster than anyone could stop it. This is the story the HOA never wanted told. Before we begin, like this video and comment where you're watching from so we know who's standing with us. The sound came first, a tearing groan that made every heart freeze. Then it hit, a roar of wood snapping and metal screaming as the tree gave way. The weight crushed straight down onto Karen's brand new carbon fiber BMW M5, a car she had paraded through the neighborhood just days before. Airbags burst in a cloud, the roof folded like paper, and her pride shattered with it. For a split second there was silence, the kind of silence that swallows oxygen. Then her voice cut through like a knife. She threw her arm out, hand stiff, finger locked on her neighbor, as if she could burn him alive just by pointing. Her screams carried rage and despair, a storm inside a single woman who had demanded control but just lost everything. The officers on scene stiffened, caught between her accusations and the wreck at their feet. She shouted his name like it was a crime, claimed he set her up, claimed he knew this would happen. The man she blamed didn't move. He didn't smirk, didn't flinch. He simply stood in the wreckage of her fury with a calmness that rattled her even more. That calmness told a story she didn't want told, a story the cops now wanted to hear. Why had they been called here before the tree even fell? Why did the worker gripping the chainsaw look like he was holding a confession in his hands? The worker's eyes darted between Karen and the crushed BMW, sweat mixing with fear. He had cut the trunk because she demanded it, yet the way it fell told the truth about angles, about intent. He knew it, she knew it, and the crowd was beginning to sense it. Karen's voice rose higher, painting herself as the victim, demanding someone be punished, demanding the neighbor be cuffed right there in front of everyone. But the officer didn't reach for him. He stepped closer to the fallen trunk, crouched, and pulled something from the splintered wood. A fragment of red paper. Torn, faded, but still marked. The missing protection tag. The officer's eyes lifted slowly, and they didn't rest on the accused man. They locked onto Karen. The air shifted. Neighbors whispered. The officer held up the fragment like a piece of evidence in court. He asked one question, sharp and loud enough to still the chaos. Who removed the tag? The worker dropped his eyes. Karen's jaw clenched. The man she accused stood steady, saying nothing, because the silence itself was louder than any defense. Everyone knew what a missing tag meant. Everyone knew what tampering meant. And if this fragment could be traced, then Karen's crusade had just turned into her trap. Her voice broke under the weight of the moment. She doubled down, screaming that the neighbor forged it, that it was planted, that none of this was her fault. But her words tumbled out too fast, and panic clung to them like smoke. The officers didn't answer her accusations. They glanced at the worker. His lips trembled. His knuckles whitened around the chainsaw handle. He looked ready to speak, but fear sealed his throat. Karen saw it, and her hand pointed harder, desperate, as if doubling her accusation could erase the truth about to spill from his mouth. The crowd's murmurs grew into judgment. Parents pulled children closer. Neighbors leaned into one another, the weight of collective suspicion shifting onto the woman who had been so certain of her power. For the first time, Karen's confident mask cracked in public, and what spilled through it wasn't command. It was fear. Real fear that this time her authority wouldn't protect her, her board wouldn't defend her, and her shiny car wouldn't restore her reputation. Her control was collapsing as fast as the BMW's roof. The officer didn't cuff anyone yet. Instead, he turned the fragment in his hand, eyes moving from Karen to the worker, then to the neighbor still standing silent, and back again. His voice cut the air one final time, asking who touched the tag. No one answered. Not yet. But in that pause, every person watching knew something was about to break. A secret was waiting to detonate, a betrayal waiting to erupt, and when it did, the story wouldn't just be about a tree and a car. It would be about power, truth, and the price of playing God with other people's lives. If you felt your chest tighten when that tree crushed the BMW, tell me in the comments what you would have done in that moment. Stand silent or shout the truth. And make sure to like this video before we continue. because the next second of this story decides who walks free and who doesn't walk away at all. The feud hadn't started with a crash of wood and metal. It started with a slip of paper taped to a door, a violation notice stamped in red ink, like a scarlet letter. The words were simple but heavy: remove the tree or face penalties. To Karen, it was just another move in her endless game of control. To him, it was a threat to the last living thing his father had planted before he passed. Every fine, every letter, every late-night knock wasn't just about a tree. It was about erasing a piece of his bloodline. That's why he refused. That's why the battle became war. Karen didn't come alone to fight it. She rallied the HOA board with whispers of safety hazards and lawsuits. She promised neighbors that the tree leaned too close, that one gust could spell disaster. Some believed her. Others stayed quiet, afraid of her wrath. But behind the closed doors of her house, messages flew long after midnight. Plans to bypass permits, strategies to corner him before the city inspector could protect him. She didn't want compromise. She wanted conquest. He wasn't blind to her game. He nailed the official protection notice straight to the trunk, its ink shining like a shield. He thought that would end it. He thought the law itself would be enough. But by morning, the notice was gone. Torn clean, not by accident. That missing tag became the ghost at the center of everything, a haunting piece of evidence no one could find. And now, the officer's hand holding that fragment had resurrected it like a spirit refusing to die. Karen had already pushed the timeline into overdrive. She called an emergency HOA session, summoning the board to her living room. She painted herself as a hero, the savior who would eliminate a danger before the city dragged its feet. She didn't tell them she had already lined up the worker, cash on the table, chainsaw sharpened. She didn't tell them about the midnight messages stamped with her login. She just handed them papers, and they signed, their signatures binding her revenge in ink. The betrayal wasn't the boardroom, it was the timing. Hours later, before dawn, the worker's phone buzzed with her demand: start at sunrise. His hands shook reading that text. He knew the law, he knew the risk, but the money was real and the pressure heavier than the saw. He showed up when the world was still gray, tracing the cut he knew he shouldn't make. But Karen wanted proof. She wanted the fall directed toward the driveway, so she could scream danger at the crowd. He warned her once, quietly, that it wasn't safe. She brushed him off. By the time the officers arrived, called not by her, but by an anonymous neighbor sick of the drama, the plan was already spinning out of control. Every eye turned when the officer muttered into his radio, mentioning charges if the removal was unauthorized. Karen's face hardened at those words. That was the first crack in her certainty. And cracks have a way of spreading fast. The worker felt it too, his secret gnawing at his chest, the text still glowing on his phone like an unpaid debt. The neighbor she accused stood steady, saying nothing, because silence sometimes screams louder than any defense. He knew something Karen didn't want anyone else to know, that the truth was crawling closer, ready to bare its teeth. The crash of the BMW was only the start. The real collision was coming, a collision of lies and proof, of forged papers and hidden logins. The neighbors sensed it. Their whispers turned to questions, questions turned to stares, and stares turned to suspicion. Karen's grip on power was slipping, her white shirt now clinging to a desperation she couldn't disguise. And still she pointed, arm extended, demanding justice, demanding the officers obey her voice. But authority doesn't bend forever. Sooner or later, it bites back. Her own allies began to shift in their silence. They had signed her papers, but they hadn't signed up for this. Insurance calls were already in motion, rumors spreading like fire that no coverage would touch a car crushed by an illegal cut. The story wasn't just a neighborhood drama anymore. It was money, liability, and the smell of lawsuits in the air. And with every second she refused to back down, her noose tightened. Her voice climbed in pitch, shriller, louder, but the eyes around her no longer saw strength. They saw fear. The officer studied the fragment again, his voice flat as he confirmed into his radio that tampering was a punishable offense. Karen swallowed hard, her eyes darting, her hands still frozen in that accusation, as if she could hold the world back with one gesture. The worker's chest heaved, his saw now silent, but his conscience screaming. He wasn't sure if he could keep carrying her secret. He wasn't sure if her money was worth the stain it left on his hands. The truth trembled on his lips, And when it came out, it wouldn't just shatter Karen's story. It would drag the entire HOA into the fire. What would you have done in that moment, standing in the crowd, watching it all collapse? Would you stay quiet or call out the lie? Tell me in the comments, and don't forget to like this video, because the next turn in this story will change everything. The officer's voice cut through the noise like a blade. He held the red fragment higher, his tone colder now, and demanded answers. Karen's lips trembled, but instead of silence, she doubled down. She barked that the tag was never real, that it was planted to frame her. Her words cracked as fast as her pride, yet she kept spitting them out, hoping volume could mask the lie. But the crowd didn't buy it. They had seen her control before. They had felt her rules pressed down like chains. Now, for the first time, they were watching those chains snap. The worker's breathing grew heavier, his eyes darting from the fragment to Karen, from Karen to the officer, as if the truth itself was climbing up his throat. His shoulders shook under the weight of the lie he carried. Karen saw it too. She hissed at him under her breath, desperate, telling him to keep quiet, to stand firm, to remember the deal. But fear doesn't obey contracts. His silence was breaking, and she knew it. That's why her arm swung back at the neighbor again, her whole hand stretched, accusing him louder, trying to shift the fire before it burned her alive. One officer pulled out a phone and called the city arborist on speaker. The crowd fell silent as the voice came through. Calm, firm, and absolute. The tree was a heritage listing. The tag meant protected status. Any removal without it still intact was illegal. And when the officer asked if a printout claiming disease could override that, the voice laughed with disbelief. Only the QR code from the original tag could confirm inspection. The QR code was gone. The neighbor's silence now looked like dignity. Karen's noise looked like guilt. The worker stepped forward, chainsaw still in his hands, his voice trembling. He admitted he warned her. He told her the lien would send it crashing into the driveway. He said she told him to angle it that way anyway. Karen spun, her face twisting, calling him a liar, calling him incompetent, throwing every insult she could find to bury his confession. But his shaking hands, his cracking voice, and his guilty eyes were louder than her words. And when the officer asked if anyone had proof, the worker whispered that his phone still held her text. Gasps spread through the crowd. Karen lunged with words, shouting that the message was forged, that he was trying to save himself by dragging her down. But the officer had already stretched out his hand, palm up, demanding the phone. The worker hesitated, sweat dripping, then placed the device into the officer's grip like it was both a confession and a release. The screen lit up, the message there in plain sight. Start at sunrise. Angle toward the driveway. Her name glowing at the top of the thread. Karen's scream was no longer authority. It was panic. It cracked, desperate, begging them to see her as the victim. She insisted it wasn't her, that someone hacked her login, that this was a setup bigger than her. But the officer didn't flinch. He studied the text, studied her face, then slowly reached toward his belt. The crowd held its breath. Karen's arm stayed extended, pointing at the neighbor like a statue frozen in rage, shouting one last time to cuff him. The officer's hand closed around the metal, and for a heartbeat everyone believed it would be the neighbor. The cuffs snapped open. The officer moved fast, but not toward the man she hated. He stepped toward the worker. In a swift motion, steel wrapped around the worker's wrists. Karen gasped, relief and triumph flooding her face all at once. She laughed through tears, claiming justice had been done, shouting that this proved her innocence. The worker dropped his head, shame heavy on his shoulders. The neighbor still said nothing, his eyes locked on Karen as if he already knew what would come next. But the crowd wasn't convinced. Their whispers didn't sound like agreement. They sounded like suspicion. They had seen the text, heard the arborist, watched the panic in Karen's eyes. If the worker was in cuffs, why did it feel like Karen was the one trapped? The officer didn't explain. He only muttered that the truth was still unraveling, and this was far from over. His body cam light blinked red, recording every word, every scream, every accusation. Karen stood taller, as if winning this round could erase the cracks spreading under her feet. She pointed again, venom dripping from her voice, demanding the neighbor be next. But her eyes betrayed her. Deep down, she knew the spotlight wasn't leaving her. It was circling closer, waiting to scorch her at the worst possible moment. And as the worker's chains clinked in the silence, The officer lifted his radio and called for backup. His words were measured but heavy. Evidence tampering. Unauthorized removal. Witness testimony. Suspected forgery. Karen's face fell. The words hung in the air like thunder. Her victory was already crumbling before her eyes, and she couldn't stop it. The neighbors could feel the shift. They leaned in, sensing the story wasn't ending. It was just beginning. And as the second patrol car rolled into view, the officer's eyes met Karen's once more. The next words out of his mouth would decide everything. And this time, no amount of pointing could save her. If you're still watching this moment unfold, drop a heart in the comments so I know you felt the sting of that twist, because what happens next will flip this story upside down. The cuffs clicked shut around the worker's wrists, but the victory Karen felt was short-lived. His head hung low, yet his voice cracked open the silence with a confession that split the air like lightning. He said he warned her. He said she demanded the angle, demanded the driveway, demanded proof that the tree was a hazard. His words were not shouted. They were broken, trembling, but they cut deeper than any scream. The crowd gasped, and Karen's triumph dissolved on her tongue. She shouted back, clawing at the story, twisting it, insisting he was lying to save himself. But every eye around her no longer saw a liar in the man with cuffs. They saw a puppet, and she was the one holding the strings. The officer's radio crackled with the replay of the arborist's words: heritage tree, illegal removal, punishable offense. Karen's shouts grew shrill, louder, clawing at the air as if she could drown out the truth. She snapped that the neighbor had parked the BMW in that exact spot just to frame her, that he had orchestrated the disaster. But the officer touched his body cam and replayed a clip. Karen's own voice echoed back at her, sharp, commanding, telling the worker to angle the cut toward the driveway. Her face went pale, her lips trembling as the crowd heard her orders in her own tone, undeniable and damning. And then the moment came that no one expected. A child's voice pierced the chaos. The neighbor's kid, no older than 10, had wandered too close, small shoes crunching broken glass near the shattered car. Gasps rippled. Parents screamed for him to step back. Karen's hand dropped from pointing at her rival to covering her mouth in shock. The neighbor moved faster than anyone else, arms outstretched, pulling the boy away from the danger, shielding him as the crowd erupted. The image burned itself into every witness. One stood calm, protecting life, while the other screamed only about her car and her pride. The crowd began to turn. Whispers became murmurs. Murmurs became accusations. People questioned why Karen was more concerned about blame than safety, why her voice shook with panic, why the story kept slipping through her fingers. The officers tightened their posture, sensing the shift in power. The worker's confession, the body cam evidence, the missing tag, the child's safety, all threads weaving into one rope pulling her down. Karen tried to strike back. She yelled that the entire neighborhood was against her, that she was the victim of a conspiracy, that her car, her money, her status were being used to tear her apart. But the more she screamed, the more hollow it sounded. Her words rang out like broken bells, while the neighbor's silence felt like iron. Every glare, every whisper now cut into her skin. She wasn't untouchable anymore. She was exposed. The officer's voice came again, calm but heavy, announcing that further investigation was necessary. But before Karen could protest, another voice joined the chaos. The HOA president himself, red-faced and nervous, stepped into the crowd holding a sealed packet of papers. His hands shook as he passed it to the officer, claiming it was official board documentation. But when the seal broke, the packet told a story darker than Karen wanted anyone to know. Inside was a stamped approval, a violation already marked and signed before the incident had even happened. And the timestamp at the bottom was damning. It had been filed hours before sunrise. The crowd gasped again. Karen froze, caught between disbelief and rage. How could she explain a violation prepared before the accident, before the cut, before the crash? The officer flipped through the packet, his eyes narrowing. Evidence forged. Papers falsified. This wasn't negligence anymore. This was premeditated. The truth was tearing her fortress down, brick by brick, and everyone was watching it collapse. Her scream broke the silence, calling it fake, calling it doctored, swearing that someone had hacked her account. But even as the words flew, the crowd wasn't looking at her anymore. They were looking at the officer holding the packet like it was the final nail in her coffin. Karen's hand lifted again, shaking, pointing desperately at the neighbor one more time, her voice cracking as she begged for them to see him as the enemy. But no one moved. No one believed. Sirens grew louder in the distance. Another patrol car arriving. Backup summoned to contain what was now spiraling into something much bigger than a neighbor feud. The worker's cuffs clinked in the silence. The kid clung to his father's side, and Karen's arm trembled in the air, pointing at nothing but her own crumbling power. And then the officer spoke, his words cold and final. Forged approvals. Evidence tampering. Suspected conspiracy. His voice shook the ground beneath her. If you were standing in that crowd, would you have shouted the truth or stayed silent? Tell me in the comments, and don't forget to like this video, because the next moment is where the entire board begins to fracture, and Karen is left with nowhere left to run. The packet in the officer's hands became the weapon Karen could not fight. The timestamp glared back like a wound she couldn't cover. It showed the violation approved hours before the crash, long before the chainsaw even touched bark. Neighbors gasped, whispering. Each page turned like a knife slicing into her story. She tried to speak, to shout, but her voice faltered against the weight of her own signature stamped at the bottom. It wasn't rumor anymore. It was proof. Her allies on the HOA board, the same ones who once cheered her power, now avoided her eyes. One of them pulled out his phone, hands shaking, and revealed what he had kept hidden. A screenshot of the board's private group chat, messages glowing on the screen for all to see. Plans written in her own words, strategies typed out to teach him compliance, instructions to push the violation through even if the city dragged its feet. The screenshot passed from hand to hand like contraband, each neighbor's face hardening with betrayal. She hadn't been protecting them. She had been playing them. The insurance call came next. A voice over the phone carried through the crowd. The crushed BMW, the pride of her driveway, would not be covered. The adjuster explained that because the tree had been under protection status and the removal unauthorized, her policy was void. Every neighbor heard the words, and the look on her face was devastation disguised as rage. The very thing she flaunted as untouchable status was now nothing but twisted steel and shattered glass, a monument to her arrogance. The worker, still cuffed, found his voice again. Shame filled every word as he told them she had pressured him, demanded speed, waved cash in his face, and threatened to blacklist him if he refused. He admitted he was weak, that he gave in, but he swore she was the architect. His voice cracked under the weight of his own guilt, and for once the crowd pitted him. Not her. Him. Karen lashed out, spitting venom, calling him a coward, a liar, a desperate man trying to shift blame. But her voice no longer commanded fear. It only exposed her desperation. The officer wrote faster now, pen scratching against his pad, the body cam capturing every outburst. Karen realized the circle was closing. She turned to the board, demanding they defend her, that they tell the officers this was all a misunderstanding. But one by one, their heads dropped. They weren't going to burn with her. They whispered that she had gone too far, that they had signed what they thought were routine violations, that they never approved this madness. The betrayal cut her deeper than the wrecked BMW. She had built her empire on fear, and now it crumbled as the very people she ruled abandoned her. And then came the moment that silenced even her screams. The city arborist truck pulled up, the door slammed, and he stepped out carrying a replacement red tag and a citation book thick with authority. His face was stern, his steps unshaken. He asked one question that landed like a hammer. Who removed the original tag? The crowd shifted, every eye snapping to Karen. Her face flushed, her lips parted, but no sound came. For the first time, she had no script, no excuse, no one left to shield her. The arborist held the citation book like judgment itself. Unauthorized removal of a heritage tree. Evidence tampering. Forgery of official documents. His voice carried weight that even the officers respected. He turned to the patrol car, nodded once, and the second set of cuffs was pulled free. The sound of metal unlocking made Karen's knees shake. She stumbled backward, screaming that it was all lies, that this was a setup, that she was being framed. But the crowd wasn't listening anymore. They had chosen their side. The neighbor who had said nothing throughout it all finally stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice, didn't point, didn't gloat. He simply looked at her, and asked the question no one else had spoken aloud. Was it worth it? Was the car, the fines, the power worth destroying a family's legacy? His words hung in the air, and Karen's face twisted with fury because she had no answer. And in that silence, her empire collapsed. If you're still here, tell me in the comments what you think Karen deserves at this moment, mercy or justice. And make sure to like this video, because the next chapter reveals the price she'll pay when the law finally takes its full swing. The arborist's voice carried the weight of finality. He declared the oak a heritage tree, untouchable by law, its protection as old as the neighborhood itself. Unauthorized removal wasn't just a violation, it was a crime. Karen's scream cracked the moment like glass, her words stumbling as she tried to paint herself as the victim once again. But the list of charges rattled off in front of the crowd spoke louder than her panic. Evidence tampering, forgery, endangerment, property destruction. Every word was a nail sealing the coffin she had built with her own hands. The officer's cuffs snapped open with a metallic bite, and the crowd leaned forward as he approached her. She stepped back, hands trembling, eyes darting to the faces that once followed her commands. None of them moved for her. None of them reached to help. The mask of authority she wore so proudly had dissolved into nothing. She pleaded, swearing she hadn't meant harm, that she was under pressure, that she was drowning in debt, that she just wanted safety. But the voices around her didn't echo sympathy. They echoed disbelief. They had lived under her shadow for too long to believe her now. Her knees buckled when the officer read her rights aloud, her voice faltering as she tried to talk over him. She begged them to look at the wrecked BMW, to see the humiliation she'd already suffered, to let that be her punishment. But the silence of the crowd cut deeper than steel. They didn't see loss, they saw karma. They saw a woman who thought her money and influence made her untouchable, and now she was shackled by the very rules she had used to shackle them. The neighbor finally spoke, his voice calm, but edged with fire. He said she wasn't punished for the car, or the tree, or even the lies. She was punished because she forgot what power really was. Power was protecting, not destroying. Power was lifting, not crushing. His words landed like thunder, each one digging into Karen's pride. She tried to spit back, tried to call him self-righteous, but the words drowned in the noise of her own downfall. The people who once feared her now turned their eyes away from her cries. Fear had shifted, and now it lived in her. For the first time, Karen's voice cracked into something human. She begged not to be taken in front of everyone. She pleaded for mercy, her voice breaking into sobs. She swore she had no one left, that she was alone, that she had built her walls so high she couldn't climb out now that they were collapsing. And for a heartbeat, even the officer paused, his grip tightening on her arm as if to steady himself against her desperation. The crowd wavered too. They weren't blind to her fear. They weren't heartless. They just couldn't forget the years she made them suffer under the weight of her rules. The neighbor's silence spoke louder than any verdict. He looked at her, not with hatred, not with triumph, but with something she didn't expect. Pity. It was the kind of pity that burned more than rage, the kind of pity that told her she was already beaten. His eyes told her she could scream, fight, plead, but nothing would change the truth. Her empire of threats was over. All that remained was her shame. The officers guided her toward the patrol car, her voice fading into broken sobs as she tried one last time to claw her way back into control. She shouted at the board, called them traitors, swore she would expose their secrets too. But her words carried no weight anymore. No one believed, no one followed, no one cared. She was a queen stripped of her crown, dragged before the very people she thought she owned. And as she was pushed into the back seat, her reflection in the shattered glass of her BMW stared back at her, a ghost of the woman who thought she could never fall. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't clap. They simply stood in silence, watching her be taken away. The silence wasn't empty. It was justice. It was the sound of power returning to the people she had tried to silence. And as the car door slammed shut, it wasn't her scream that echoed. It was the calm voice of the neighbor, low but steady, promising the community that the story wasn't over yet. Because what came next wasn't just about Karen. It was about rebuilding everything she had tried to destroy. If you felt that shift, drop a comment right now and tell me. Do you believe mercy has a place in justice? Or does justice mean letting people face every consequence they earned? And make sure you like this video, because the last part will show the choice that decides everything. The neighborhood stood still after the patrol car pulled away, its taillights fading, leaving behind an emptiness that felt louder than her screams. Karen was gone, but her shadow lingered. The crowd turned toward the man she had tried to destroy, waiting for him to speak, waiting to know if this was victory or just another battle in a war they all had been dragged into. His voice was steady, but heavy with the weight of every twist that had unfolded. He said this was never about revenge. It was about legacy, about not letting fear uproot what mattered most. His words carried the pain of someone who had lost too much already, but also the strength of someone who refused to lose anymore. The HOA board shuffled uneasily, caught between guilt and survival. Their signatures sat like chains around their necks, their complicity exposed. One of them broke down first, stammering apologies, insisting they never knew how far she would go, that they only signed because they feared her wrath. The crowd didn't spare them. Neighbors demanded answers, demanded accountability, demanded to know why they allowed her tyranny to stand so long. Their excuses sounded thin, brittle, falling apart under the weight of their own cowardice. The balance of power had shifted, and the board could feel it slipping through their fingers. Then came the worker, wrists still marked from the cuffs. He raised his head and asked for a chance to make it right. He admitted his weakness, admitted he had taken the money, but he swore he would testify against her, rebuild what was broken, and stand with the truth. His words struck the crowd because they were raw, flawed, and real. Unlike Karen, he wasn't pretending to be untouchable. He was admitting his failure. That humility turned the crowd in his favor. He wasn't a villain anymore. He was another casualty of her manipulation, and in his brokenness, he found redemption. The officer returned to the center, announcing what everyone had been waiting for. Karen would face charges, not just fines or community shaming, but real charges that would stain her record forever. Forgery, conspiracy, endangerment, and the destruction of protected property. The weight of those words rippled through the people who had lived in fear for years. It wasn't just her punishment. It was their freedom. A chain had broken, and the air felt different, lighter, as if the whole community had taken its first breath in years. But the neighbor didn't let it end there. He turned to the board and told them the truth no one else would say aloud. They had two choices: step down and let the community heal, or face the same spotlight Karen had just crumbled under. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the authority of a man who had stood through fire and refused to bow. The board members looked at one another, pale and shaken, and in that silence, the decision was clear. Their reign was finished. They nodded, voices weak, admitting they would resign. The crowd erupted, not with chaos, but with something stronger. Relief. Hope. The beginning of something new. And then came the moment that tied it all together. The neighbor walked back to the shattered remains of the BMW, bent down, and lifted a single acorn that had fallen from the oak. He held it in his hand, raising it for everyone to see. He said his father planted the oak to stand for generations, and even though they tried to cut it down, its seed would live on. The crowd fell silent, moved by the symbolism, by the truth that even in destruction, life could grow again. He knelt beside his son, placed the acorn in his palm, and whispered that one day they would plant it together. Tears glimmered in more than one set of eyes as neighbors stepped forward, one after another, offering to help, offering to replant, offering to rebuild. The same people Karen had ruled through fear now stood shoulder to shoulder, united not by rules but by choice. Her pointing finger had tried to divide them, but now their open hands were pulling each other closer. And in that unity, they found something more powerful than fear had ever been. They found strength. The last image burned into everyone's memory wasn't the wrecked BMW or the flashing sirens. It was a community standing together, a child clutching an acorn, and a man finally able to smile not because he won, but because the people around him chose to rise. The story that began with a demand ended with a choice, and the choice was hope. If this moment struck you as deeply as it struck them, like this video, share it with someone who needs to see justice turn into hope, and comment what you would have done if you were standing there that day, because your voice decides how stories like this live on.